Welcome back, everyone. This particular session, I'm just going to show you books that I got recently. The first one, this one I got an email on. I follow the author Francisco Jimenez. He wrote a story in Spanish around middle school level about his experiences as an immigrant child in the 1940s. And I believe it's a series of 4 books. They can also be found in English. And I think altogether, those books can come together as one story called The Circuit. And I found out that a graphic novel had been made of the book The Circuit, covering his whole experience in that whole series. And I picked this up at my local Barnes & Noble. And this is the graphic novel of his time, basically, as an immigrant from Mexico in the 1940s. And the struggles that they went through, that his parents went through. They were just, I believe, 2 children when they crossed, and by the time they'd spent, I don't know how many years there, 10 or so, they were now 7 children. So he talks about the struggles of learning to speak English, his desire to do well in school, constantly having to move around and feeling like he kind of lost out because he wanted to finish his school year. He had to help his parents. And then I remember the point in his story where he was in high school and they were staying in this particular town. I think it was Santa Maria or somewhere nearby. And he was working, this was the 1950s, he was working 30 hours a week as a custodian in the evenings. And when he was done, he'd sit down and do his homework. So he'd go to bed really late, then get up early and go to school, then go to work, then do his homework. That's endurance. You know, he really had a dream, and he really wanted to pursue it. And he had people telling him, some of the American staff, that he probably shouldn't pursue more, that he should be grateful for what he had, if I'm remembering my story correctly. But he was very fortunate. He had a counselor at his high school who encouraged him, who showed him how he could get into college, who helped him every step of the way, who really believed in him. And that really kind of stuck out with me. You know, sometimes it takes just one person for you to be willing to take the necessary steps. And I believe he went to Santa Clarita College up north, and that's where he got his bachelor's degree. And he talks about, he had a roommate who was very kind to him, was very nice, they were good friends. And that guy played in sports. And Francisco couldn't understand how his roommate had time for sports and to get all his homework done, and why he did so well. And Francisco, who just had school, really had to work longer and harder to accomplish the same thing. And it was just very kind that his roommate was willing to come alongside him and help him and show him a few shortcuts. And it was really neat. And what struck me? Being someone who's spoken Spanish her whole life, when Francisco was in college, one of the classes he took was Spanish. And if I'm remembering correctly, it was college. This wasn't high school, this was college. And he learned that some of the ways that he was speaking Spanish were incorrect. He brought up with his father, he goes, Dad, we're not, when we say no one, the word no one in Spanish is nadie. Francisco told his father, we've been saying it wrong. We don't say naiden, we say nadien. But that kind of struck me. It took coming to America, and waiting until he was 17, 18 years old and going to college before he finally learned that his Spanish was wrong. And he was in the United States when he learned that. So that's an incident that really struck me in this story. So this is The Circuit by Francisco Jimenez, graphic novel. They have the story, The Circuit, as well. That's not a graphic novel in regular prose. And because I'm going to be approaching American history, and you'll hear both sides of the story that I'm sure we're all aware of. There's all the different factions. I want to read a little both, right? I want to hear what both have to say and what sources they're basing their information on. So I found out about a book by Carol Delaney entitled Columbus and the Quest for Jerusalem. And this author takes the perspective, what some people would consider the more traditional perspective, but I'm gonna pull away from that. This is one perspective, and she does list her sources. The subtitle of this book is How Religion Drove the Voyages That Led to America. So that tells you what perspective Delaney took. Now I'm looking forward to this. I found out about this book from another booktuber, and he was very impressed by it. He thought, okay, I always learned it one way, and I'm glad I read it this way because she's really shown me some facts that I was unaware of. So that intrigued me. So I'm adding this to my American history shelf, and I have books on there such as 1491 and the 1619 Project. So I like to have a good blend as much as I can. So when I do get to my American history part in my chronological studies, I'm going to be covering this. Okay. And the next one I found, now this is an author that I'm sure you're all going to be aware of because you've seen him on TV perhaps. It is by, and you will know him, Henry Louis Gates Jr. He's the Alphonse Fletcher University professor and director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. And Professor Gates did a series on PBS on the African Americans, and there was an accompanying book that was published. I have that one. I also have his book Stony the Road, and this one here is called The Signifying Monkey, A Theory of African American Literary Criticism, with a new preface by the author Henry Louis Gates Jr. So this is three. He's written several books, but this is a third in a series, and this is dealing more with literary theory, African American literary theory. So this is going to go on my shelf with literary theory. I'm looking forward to this. And speaking of literary theory, I got these two mini books that are from the same series as when I was trying to understand what literary criticism was. And I purchased like a zillion books to try to get my bearings. Well, this little series from Oxford had one of them, but they also have other topics. I found a couple more at my local Barnes & Noble. These little mini books. This one is on the Gothic, a very short introduction. And it covers Gothic in every form, architecture and literature, clothing, culture. Good little reference. And the other one I found is on Spanish literature, a very short introduction. And this works great with my history studies as it, because I incorporate literature, this is going to give me a little background. So that's also excellent. Next book, I've been motivated because I've been watching on YouTube. I'm going to put the link down there, perhaps for at least one of them, at least for the author that I purchased a book from. When you get bookshelf tours and something I really enjoy watching. Well, for some reason, I don't know how it happened. I was, when they give recommendations on your YouTube channel, this was a recommendation for bookshelf tours of Latin American and Hispanic authors. I thought, oh, cool, it's all in Spanish. And I clicked on to the first one, and I got to learn more about him as an author, his life, his craft, and I saw his bookshelves. And I was like, wow, this is really cool. So I've been watching these like one every day and getting more and more familiar with modern day Latin American and Hispanic authors. So I decided when I went to the bookstore that I was going to look for a book by one of these authors. And the one that I found was by Mario Vargas Llosa, and this is an English translation of one of his books, Aunt Julia and the Scriptwriter. I went upstairs to the Spanish language books to see if I could find the same story in Spanish, and I couldn't. So I came home with this one. And this author talks about how he spent several years with another very well-known Latin American author, Jorge Luis Borges. This is a name I think a lot of you may be familiar with if you've read his works in English. So I thought, you know what? I don't want to get that other book by Llosa, not this one, but another one that I found where he talks about his time with Borges until I learn more about Borges. So I went to the Spanish language section to find a book in Spanish that Borges wrote, and I got it. And this one is called Cuentos Completos, Complete Stories. So I'll pick at least one. I'm slower with Spanish. I don't read it as often as I read English. I should. That's what I think. Maybe for every 2 books that I'm reading in English, maybe I should read 1 in Spanish. I've got to exercise that muscle. I've got to, be able to pick up my speed and increase my comprehension. So I know one of these stories here is going to be a bit of a slow read, but I can tell myself I've read Borges, and then I can read the book by Llosa. So I got these 2 books. And when I went to Bart's Books in Ojai, and I have a video on that, a tour of that, this is the book that I picked up by Carl Jung. This is a book that Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, an autobiography, a memoir. I began reading it a few years ago. I'd gotten a library copy. And I found it very interesting where he comes from. You kind of I got a better perception of where he was, not just intellectually, but spiritually, and what motivated his particular focus as a psychologist. And had to return the book after 2 extensions because I was going to school and I was working and I was looking after my parents, so I didn't have a whole lot of time. But I promised myself that one day I would buy the book, that way I'd have more than enough time to read it through all the way. And I got it. I got this at Bart's Books. So that's that one. And these next 2 books are related in a way. The FBI closed up its classified files for like 60 years, 55 plus years or 60 years, whatever it was. And they've recently been released. And based on that information, I read from a couple of authors who were able to put together a story based on a lot of that newly declassified FBI information. And one of them was on King, A Life. Now, I purchased this book, but I listened to it on Audible, and I loved it so much that I had to go out and purchase the books. There are parts of this book that I want to go back to and make note of and go back over again. This is a very real, it's a very real biography of King, faults and all, right? And it's honest, and that's what I appreciate. But when you look at it, it's category monster book because it is thicker. But if you don't want to read the book and you want to listen to it on Audible, go ahead, because the narrator did an excellent job of narrating the book. It really just has some really phenomenal information, and you get to know the infamous Edgar J. Hoover, who really did not like King. King did not fit his mold of what an American should be, and he was pretty determined to destroy King. And what's interesting is that when they did get some dirt on King, and Edgar would, Hoover would, in his way, encourage his staff to release that information to the journalists, which they did. The journalists chose not to publish it. To their credit, I will say, to their credit. And Hoover's mentioned a lot in King's book. And so what I did is I found out, I don't know if this was recommended in the book or not. It probably was mentioned in the book. So I went out and I bought it, and this is called The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover, also based on a lot of recently declassified FBI documents. I have not read this yet, but I will. These 2 really, this guy was after this guy. So, and these 2 books are based on the same type of information, declassified FBI documents. So these are really cool books. These are going to go into my memoir / current events, whatever. But yeah, these 2 books, my nice hard copy books. So that's it, everyone. I'm happy to share this with all of you. Please take care of yourselves, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.